Ladies and gentlemen, the man before you is Steve Goodwin. He's chief engineer, and he is a person I alluded to in my two blog posts about Vertex new drug. Steve, talk to my viewers about, first of all, your experience with hepatitis C.
Well, it's a long story, but I'm going to try to keep it short for you. I first discovered that I had hepatitis C back in 2002. And at that particular point, it came to my realization that I'd had it already for well over 30 years. And the discovery was based on the blood test that I had requested my doctor to give me as a result of some earlier findings that were found back in 1983 when I filed some applications for insurance because we were thinking of having a family. And at that particular point, hepatitis C wasn't even known. If anything, they would qualify it as non-A, non-B, but there was no test for hepatitis C. And I did have some elevated enzymes at that particular point back in 1983. And so one of the things that the insurance company asked of my doctor was to basically clarify with some statements as to whether or not there were any concerns about those elevated enzymes. He came back and basically said, nah, there was really no problem. That I wasn't really all that far out of range, and that for me it might have been just perfectly acceptable in my norm. So lo and behold, back in 2002 when I had a physical examination and asked my doctor, after having just regular blood work done, how my enzymes were, he explained that typically liver enzymes are not tested for a regular physical. And I explained to him that previously, many years before, they had been tested somewhat on a high side, out of the normal range. So at that particular point, he was obligated to go back to the files, sure enough, take a look at the information that was there, and then he asked me to come in to basically have a hepatitis C antibody test. Came back, said, Steve, it doesn't necessarily mean you have hepatitis C, but it means that you've been exposed to it and you have the antibodies. And so I don't think there's anything to worry about, but come on in, we need to do another blood test, which was then a viral load test. And sure enough, got the telephone call first week of May 2002 that indeed I had hepatitis C. So believe me, that was a rude awakening. And there's certainly a lot that's transpired since that period of time.
I'm curious, did you have any body changes or anything going on with you that you sensed yourself that made your quality of life more difficult? And how did this,
Well, personally, I don't think that I really ever became symptomatic in terms of the hepatitis C. And I think that's probably the case for the vast majority of people that have hepatitis C. The Centers for Disease Control estimates that there are a little over 4.2 million people with the hepatitis C. I've seen lower projections from other groups as well, down to maybe perhaps 3.2. But you can well imagine that anywhere between 3.2 and 4.2 million people in just the United States is rather significant. With regards to the disease for myself, I never really sensed that I had any physiological problems. I've always been active, play tennis, run the treadmill, do yoga, and so I've always been rather active. The symptoms that I felt weren't until I started treatment, quite honestly, but those were side effects, nothing related to the disease itself. So,
how'd you find out about the Vertex drug?
Well, going back to 2002, I immediately got involved with a support group down in Redwood City, and it's simply called the Redwood City Support Group. And I really felt that was really beneficial because, number one, I was able to get around to talk with other people and share with a common denominator. We all had the same kind of concerns. And it was also very informative, where I was becoming more and more educated about the disease. I also went and saw a gastroenterologist within the first month and a half of knowing that I had the disease. And it was very difficult actually to get in to see the doctor. And although the doctor, certainly didn't see.
Why?
Well, there were a lot of people coming in that had hepatitis C. And once your general practitioner diagnosed you with having hepatitis C, then they basically no longer really cared for you. They would turn you over to a specialist, which would either be a gastroenterologist or a hepatologist. And so what I found was that my particular doctor, Dr. Rosenberg out of Burlingame, was that they were just inundated with all of these baby boomers that were suddenly showing up at their offices trying to make appointments.
You're scaring me.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And we're talking about anybody born between the years of 46 and 1964.
Oh, I'm 62.
All right. So
thanks, pal.
sorry about that. And
the trouble is that when I was 24, I looked like I was 40. But that's another topic for another time.
Well, the good thing is that there's tests now that can be performed in a doctor's office, and I think that's probably the big strong promotion now that's taking place with regards to testing. In the past, it would take days and sometimes even weeks to get test results back, and they'd have to go to the lab. Now these results can actually be done within 20 minutes in the office. It's just a very, very simple test, almost like doing a diabetes test. Just a little bit more involved, but nonetheless, it's
now,
really detected right there in the office.
Incivek is am I pronouncing it correctly? Incivek?
Incivek.
Incivek is a new drug. Were you skeptical? Was the clinical trial that you got into it from, or is it?
Well, actually, way even before I ever got exposed to the idea of Incivek, I was actually treated with SOC, standard of care, back in 2003. So, back in 2002 when I found out that I had the disease, the clinicians, my doctor, the nurse practitioner, and others basically said, Steve, look, we've had a biopsy. You're just a stage 1 on fibrosis, stage 2 on inflammation, and it's really not very significant. So, you've really handled the disease quite well to this point. So there's no urgency, and we're not recommending necessarily that you take any medication. However, if I wanted to take medication, they said hold out until the first part of 2003, because there was a new formulation of interferon called PEG interferon alpha 2A, which was produced by Roche, which now is basically the owner of Genentech. This particular formulation had better efficacy, but still nonetheless only had about a 40% cure rate, or an SVR, for people with genotype 1.
Versus like 80% with this one, right?
79% with the Incivek for naive treatment of
Such
patients.
an engineer, it's like 1% difference.
Yeah. Absolutely. But so I ended up going on that particular treatment, and I was very hopeful that I might be part of that 40% group that would get a cure rate. And that was planned to have been for 48 weeks. And after 12 weeks, I was given a blood test, and there were certain stopping rules that were associated with that particular treatment. And if I didn't obtain a 2-log drop at that particular point, then they indicated that I would be better off actually stopping treatment, because if I continued on and not having a 2-log drop or better within the first 12 weeks, that my efficacy cure rate would go down from 40% down to maybe 15%.
So basically, that wasn't really working out too well. Then they put you on the other drug, right?
So I became what they refer to as a non-responder. And in this case, also they refer to it as a null responder. When they talk about the 3 different types of people that don't respond, you've got.
So what are they, real quick?
Well, there's non-responders, such as myself.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's partial responders that do get a 2-log drop or greater throughout treatment. But then somewhere around 24 weeks, they still test with the virus in their blood. So that's a partial responder. Then you've got the relapsers, who are people that actually tested clear of the virus all the way up to the 48th week.
Okay.
But then they stop treatment, and all of a sudden, shortly thereafter, they test the blood and the virus is back.
So you went through all this, and then how did Incivek come into your life? How did that?
Okay, so that was 2003, and again, it was a 12-week period, and so I then decided that obviously that was not going to be the stopping point for me as far as potential treatment in the future. And one of the things that I learned from a very dear friend of mine who was actually the coordinator of the support group that I belonged to in Redwood City. Her name is Lucinda Porter. She's a registered nurse, and she writes for the HCVadvocate.org website, which is part of the HCV support group. And she told me in 2003...
That's my phone. Go ahead. Don't keep talking.
She told me in 2003 that there was these new drugs that were just beginning to come down the pipe called protease inhibitors, and that perhaps within maybe 5 years that these protease inhibitors would have a much higher efficacy rate, and not to be discouraged, and to look forward into the future for much better formulations of medications. So at that particular point, I studied really hard, and I probably ended up with binders of literature.
Oh, you sound like a doctor.
Pardon me?
You sound like a doctor. I mean,
well,
your detail and your recall is quite good.
I've
So you went all this, and basically, how did you get to Incivek? I mean, what happened?
Here's what happened on that. I knew that basically for myself, being treatment experienced, and that's sort of the euphemism for treatment failure, is that approved 3 clinical trial was going to be available, sponsored by Vertex Pharmaceuticals. And so I knew about that actually in 2006. And I really kind of ramped it up, studying all the different websites, going to the Vertex Pharmaceutical website, and getting as much information as possible from them, getting streaming video of various different conferences that they had.
Did you have to, but there was a chance, how did they even wind up taking you? Because studied is one thing, but you just call and say, damn it, I'm sick.
That's an interesting story. And I'll be quite frank with you, and I think it's pretty interesting, quite honestly. So back in 2006, when I realized that the approved 3 trial was going to be taking place, I started going to the clinicaltrials.gov website to see where registered medications were going to be. And slowly but surely, they would start parsing additional information about various different drugs. And so at that time, it was called VX950. And sure enough, it was registered with the Food and Drug Administration on their website. And at that particular point, they didn't have detailed information about the specific medical clinics throughout the United States where it was going to be taking place. Slowly but surely, more and more information was becoming available on it. And sure enough, I saw one that said California. And
just over time, you found this in one website sitting, or just?
Well, at the clinicaltrials.gov website, they would start showing additional information as it was being given to the public.
So did you call them? What happened?
Well, what I did was I then found that initially then went from California, and then it started saying, well, now San Francisco is going to have it, but they didn't identify the medical facilities where it was going to be. And San Francisco sometimes can be used kind of loosely to include maybe even Stanford.
Sure.
But the Pacific Medical Center.
I guess I'm trying to find out those details aside.
Those details were not there.
Yeah. What happened when how did you eventually contact them, and what did they say when you contacted them?
Well, here's what I did.
Okay.
Once I found out that it was going to be in San Francisco, I started calling around all the medical clinics. And I called the California Pacific Medical Center, and they said that they were not going to be sponsoring the Vertex product, VX950. I called Stanford, and they said, no, we're not going to have it. So at that particular point, I pretty much, through elimination, realized that it had to be UCSF. So I called UCSF, and I had a little bit of a white lie. And I said, I understand you're having a clinical trial for VX950, an approved 3 trial for people that have been previously treated that failed. And I've been given your telephone number and name, and I want information about being able to be a candidate for it. At that particular point, they figured that I really honestly knew what I was talking about, which I didn't. And they said, well, we are having it, and we'll give you a call back.
Wow.
So I got a call back the following day, and I found out that I was the only person outside of UCSF, as far as being a patient, that actually got into the trial. Everybody else were patients of Nora Terrald, who was the principal investigator at UCSF.
So you ended up getting a phone call?
Yeah, I received a call back from basically the clinical trial nurse in charge of the Prove 3 clinical trial at UCSF. And I apparently was getting in sort of on the tail end for all the documents that were needed. And so I had about a week and a half to jump through hoops to get all kinds of things accomplished. One was I had to go have a full eye examination. And I'm not sure exactly the reasoning behind that, but maybe perhaps there's some side effects associated with any of the 3 combination triple treatment drugs that can impact the eyes, and so they want a baseline to see where you are with your eyes. But probably more importantly was they wanted a biopsy of my liver. Now, typically, a person who gets a biopsy for liver disease, it's performed about every 5 years. And that's usually what the insurance companies will pay for as well. In this case, I'd only been about maybe 4.25 years since my previous biopsy, so I wasn't really going to be scheduled for almost another half a year. I had to have this biopsy done within a week and a half with all the test results given to UCSF in order to get into their trial. So you can well imagine, how desperate I had to be in order to persuade the doctor and medical insurance to allow me to have that biopsy performed. And so my wife certainly was very much an integral part of that support. And sure enough, I had that biopsy report in probably the very last day that I could have. And it came out again with a stage 1 on fibrosis and stage 2 on inflammation, which is perfectly acceptable for this trial. Now keep in mind, as I mentioned earlier, this particular trial was designed for people that had been previously treated with a course of an interferon-based SOC, standard of treatment, or SOC. So this particular trial then got underway probably within about another week and a half to 2 weeks after I got all my documentation in. And so, again, I was the very last person to get into the program.
And then when they administered the drug, and when did you realize this is working?
Yeah, well, I was in this particular trial. It was double blinded, and it was just kind of roll of the dice. I lucked out every way you can possibly imagine. I ended up in the exact treatment program called a T12/PR24, which happened to be 12 weeks on the telaprevir, which is now called Incivek, and another additional 24 weeks, or a full 24 weeks, on the interferon and ribavirin. So I was exactly in the control group that is now available commercially to others, which is, again, designed to be a 24-week program. And that would be, again, 12 weeks on Incivek, which would be triple treatment, in addition to the interferon and ribavirin. And then after the 12th week, the Incivek drops off, and then it's just interferon and ribavirin for another 12 weeks.
How did it change your quality of life?
Well, on the medications, it changed my quality of life rather considerably. Pretty proud to say that I never missed a day of work because of it, though. And one of the things that I noticed was that I would be short of breath because my blood cell count was certainly down rather low. And so what happens then is you just haven't got enough oxygen really flowing in your body. But there's ways of overcoming that by exercising and kind of forcing yourself to really exercise a little more than what you really want to do. Because I was in a clinical trial, they don't allow any rescue drugs per se. You pretty much have to be able to make it through on your own. And so people that drop off in clinical trials,
When you say rescue drugs, I'm confused. Isn't this a rescue drug in a sense?
Well, there's certain particular types of drugs that you can take that actually will boost your blood cell count. Mm-hmm. But the problem with that is when you're in a clinical trial, that kind of taints the results, because there may be some people that do take, various different drugs. I think one's called Procrit, mm-hmm. that increases your blood cell count, and then maybe somebody else isn't taking it. And so it really taints the clinical trial. So there's a lot of restrictions on what you can and cannot do.
But with this, I guess, but in this case with this drug, you didn't have to worry about that. Is that right?
No, I didn't, because my blood cell count never really got down that low.
Oh, there you go.
So for me, basically just a little bit of shortness of breath.
So what do you have to say about the company now? Do they?
Well,
obviously they got a hold of you, right? Something.
Well, about Vertex?
Yeah.
Well, what happened was, again, I started the treatment in 2007, mm-hmm. and it was the first week of May, and I finished up, I guess, right around October 2007. And shortly after I finished, the trial, and again, purely confidential trial, double-blinded, I had a subject number. I didn't have a name. I went ahead and sent an email to Zachary Barber, who's in the public relations department, mm-hmm. at Vertex. Mm-hmm. And I just, had overflowing emotion of joy, with the fact that I'd been able to get through the program and have an SBR.
And now you're here telling your story.
And so, I emailed Zach and explained to him that I just finished up a Proof 3 trial, and that I did very, very well on it, and that the 6-month point post-treatment would be the true SBR, but that there was no reason to believe that I wouldn't continue with that. I emailed Zach a number of occasions throughout the years of late 2007 and early 2010, and I'd heard also that Joshua Boger, Dr. Joshua Boger, was going to be retiring as the CEO, who's the founder of Vertex. And I'd sent him an email congratulating him on his retirement, and thanking him just profusely about what Vertex had done for me.
So wait, is your face going to be on the box of drugs now or something? Or?
Possibly Wheaties.
So what do you have to say to those people who have hepatitis C now?
Well, I've got to say is the opportunities now are just so fantastic for those of you that have hepatitis C. There's many people that do know that they have hepatitis C, but have been fearful of getting on the treatment, knowing that they would have to be on it for 48 weeks. That's a long haul. And not to say that some people aren't going to have to go that route, because it depends really on how the blood tests turn out after they've gone through I think a 12-week program on the triple treatment, mm-hmm. that determines whether or not they continue on with additional drugs, which would be the interferon and ribavirin, beyond the 24-week period. But I've also read some good documentation showing statistically that Vertex expects that 70% of the people that get on their program, triple treatment, are only going to have to go 24 weeks.
Wow.
And for the treatment naive folks, people that have never been treated before, mm-hmm. it's a 79% efficacy, which is fantastic. And we're talking about comparing that to what used to be right around a 40% efficacy. And
so you said something about, I think the only thing about it is you can't taste coffee very well, but how you got coffee in front of you, right?
Well, exactly.
You're drinking coffee.
I've had allergies and
mm-hmm.
a little bit of eczema throughout most of my life, but I really didn't have any rash issues. Certainly it's been reported in some rare instances where people have had some rash concerns, mm-hmm. and I think a couple of people had to drop off too as well. I say this, use Gold Bond. Mm-hmm. I'm not trying to promote Gold Bond. I don't own stock in Gold Bond, but it's an excellent lotion that helps to sort of anesthetize the skin a little bit so that you don't have the sensation of itching. I also, at night, would use white terry cloth socks on my hands, because if I was asleep at night and started getting itchy and not even being consciously aware of it, and started rubbing or scratching myself, the socks would prevent my nails from digging in on my skin, much like babies.
So we could talk to you forever, but congratulations.
Well, thank you very much. I did mention about the chocolate and coffee. That was a really tough one to bear, but tongue in cheek. If that's the only worst side effects that I had, believe me,
you keep the weight off.
It was
keep the weight off you.
Yep, absolutely.
Hey, thanks a lot.
You're welcome.